Podcast. This is episode 159 for June 23rd, 2011. I'm Ryan Schraub.
I'm Jeremy Hellstrom.
I'm John Ballard.
I'm Al Malventine.
Now, if you were looking for a podcast episode last week, I apologize. We were all in kind of emergency mode, trying to make sure that Jeremy was done flipping cars over and burning storefronts after his hockey team's loss. So apparently, if you're watching the video version, it looks like he made it, although it looks like his room is darker now because of that. So maybe they haven't turned on the lights back in Vancouver yet.
Hiding the evidence.
A good idea. So we didn't have one last week. Obviously, a lot of stuff has happened from now and then. One of the reasons we didn't actually record a show is because I was out in Seattle, very close to Vancouver, and almost made that journey. Now I'm glad I did not.
So am I.
For the AMD Fusion Developer Summit, which was kind of an interesting show. It was kind of an attempt for AMD to produce a show much like IDF, the Intel Developer Forum, although it was significantly smaller. It was the first year for it. They did have, I think, over 700 or 800 attendees. Pretty good showing and a lot of good information and some news out of that we will talk about in a bit. First, I wanted to talk about a couple of articles that went up in the last couple of weeks. One is kind of interesting for several reasons. This is the AMD A-Series Llano APU reference notebook system. If you're watching the video version, it's a very plain notebook, black, no branding. It's what do we call this, an ODM white box machine. I think this is a Clevo build. Nothing sexy about this machine. It's just there to show off the hardware. It's there to show off what the capabilities of the system are. And it did a fine job of that. We've been talking about Llano for an awful long time now, and it's finally been released, at least in the mobile front. We have a little bit longer wait for the desktop side of things. But in reality, based on what we know so far about Llano, it's going to be much more successful in the mobile market than in the desktop market because of its performance properties and its power properties and that kind of stuff. So a little bit of maybe history or background on Llano. This is the first mainstream consumer APU, accelerated processing unit, combination CPU, GPU on a single die. This is the first one from AMD in that mainstream market. Intel was actually first to market with Sandy Bridge, which combined CPU, GPU on a single die for the same price ranges of parts. Even though AMD kind of started the idea back in 2006 with the AMD ATI merger. That out of the way, the Llano platform consists of an APU and a chipset, what they are calling now a Fusion Controller Hub. I don't remember the exact model numbers of the chipsets. Do you, Josh, in this instant? It's
I think it's the A70 and the A50 for the mobile parts.
Okay. So that's, you got your standard serial ATA interfaces. They do have serial ATA 6.0 gigabit per second connections. They also have USB 3.0 on the higher end chipset of that. So it's your standard chipset, but it does actually have better features than the comparative Intel chipsets in that regard. Looking at the APU itself, you have a quad-core equivalent somewhere in the realm of like a Radeon 5400 type GPU. These are Redwood-based GPU, right, Josh? So it's this kind of...
Actually, yeah, it was 5600 would be closer because It's got 400 shaders. I think the 6600 had, 480? So it's very, very close to that.
Right. But I guess when we take into account the much different memory interface that these processors have now, that performance-wise probably won't match discrete 5600 style graphics cards, which is something we are definitely going to be able to test in our desktop front down the line here in the next couple of weeks. Speaking of that memory controller, what is kind of interesting about this processor is, as if you are well-versed in the background of computing architectures, you will know that one of the major differences between a CPU and a GPU, besides the actual processing cores, is the memory interface. DDR2, DDR3 memory interfaces are incredibly low bandwidth compared to what we are used to on a typical graphics processing unit that we're used to getting, hundreds of gigabytes per second. And on the CPU, we are really limited to, on this dual-channel DDR3 memory bus, we're limited to about 25 to 30 gigabytes per second, depending on if we're on the desktop or the notebook version of these parts. So in that regard, that's where that kind of difference in GPU performance is going to come in to play, even though we have 400 shader units on each, because the GPU portion of the Llano APU has access to significantly less memory bandwidth, which has led to some interesting tests on our desktop side where we look at how overclocking the memory bus actually affects GPU performance. Other interesting new features here, they do have a technology called AMD Turbo Core technology, and if you're guessing this is probably somewhat similar to Intel's Turbo Boost technology, you would be correct. It basically allows the processor to utilize the full TDP of the processor, whether or not you're using one core, 2 or 3 or 4 cores, whether or not you're splitting it between CPU cores and GPU cores. There's a lot of work that goes on here, although AMD kind of claims that their method to monitor and take advantage of this headroom is very different than what Intel does. Intel uses analog readings of power, of current draw, I believe, and temperature, and the AMD measurement is very hard-coded into the chip. It's very much a digital measurement as opposed to an analog measurement. Advantageous because that's very repeatable results in terms of chip-to-chip, system-to-system, infrastructure to infrastructure, you know, what kind of heating and cooling system they have built into the notebooks or the desktops. So it does work in a very similar way. If a single core is working more, or if just one single core is working while the other ones are idle, it will give more power to that, thus increasing the clock speed, that type of thing. I think, what did the highest end processor we had go up to? It was... It's kind of weird because the base clocks are very low on these processors. Let me see if I can find my table here.
Like, what, 1.5 gigahertz?
Yeah.
And then it goes up to 2.4, something like that?
Yeah, it's something like that. So the base clock of 1.5 is pretty slow. 1.5 gigahertz. So that's you think about a 1.5 gigahertz quad-core AMD Phenom processor. You're not going to get a whole lot of performance out of that. And if you look at our CPU benchmarks on the notebook platforms, you will see that. If you look at benchmarks like Cinebench, Pavre, these video transcoding ones that only use the processor like Handbrake, that type of stuff, you will see that those benchmarks, the AMD system is pretty far behind what even Intel's quad-core, Core i3, Core i5 parts are able to do, and that's because these processors are running at such a low frequency. Now, the ability to clock up to that 2.4 gigahertz for the single threads does help, but it's still, I guess it's easy to say, or we have to admit that it's, the processor portion of the APU is not that impressive. It's what we have seen before. The architecture is the same. So if you imagine taking your Phenom 2 X4 processor and downclocking it to 1.5 gigahertz or maybe up to 2 something, based on your workload, you'll easily see why this would lose in those CPU benchmarks. But obviously the push here by AMD is that you get much better graphics performance on the APU for the same total wattage TDP versus what Intel has, and that's very true. If you look at the gaming benchmarks, you will see that 3D Mark Vantage runs much better. You've got games like Just Cause 2, Far Cry 2. Those are very much in the wheelhouse here of what AMD was able to do, even rivaling some of the discrete options as well. I think the branding on the integrated graphics on this APU gets very complicated. I'm not even going to try to go through this table of stuff because lots
of numbers, lots of letters.
Yeah, there's lots of numbers and lots of letters, and because of what they're calling dual graphics technology, which is essentially crossfire between an ATI or an AMD discrete GPU and the integrated graphics on the APU, you can increase performance that way. They'll be able to take advantage of the processing power there, and you get little boosts in performance anywhere from 15 to 40% depending on the discrete GPU you're using. Now the problem with that is for every combination of discrete GPU and integrated GPU, they have a unique model number like the 6775 G2 or the 6755 G2 or the 6760 G2, and there's a whole big table. And if you really want to read it, I'm sorry, but you can go into the review and do that. And they're talking about games like Aliens vs. Predator, Far Cry 2, Unigen, they're showing results anywhere from 26 to 48% faster, just depending on what your workloads are. So yeah, the notebook itself, there wasn't really a review done of the notebook itself because this is a white box model, but there are a good overview. Matt Smith did all of our benchmarking and that type of stuff for this mobile review. He did a really good job of that. So you can go see the SciSoft Sandra results, and they're not that impressive. Memory results are okay. Anything that's CPU limited, not that great. Anything that's GPU limited, pretty impressive actually, how much graphics processing horsepower they were able to put into this APU. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you look at what AMD's own slide information shows, they talk about the makeup of what is inside a Sandy Bridge versus what is inside a Llano APU in terms of transistor count. And I believe it's like basically 50% of the APU is graphics processing, whereas was it less than 30% or less than 25% of the Intel Sandy Bridge processor is actually graphics, so it looks like,
it's actually split into thirds for AMD. I mean, they got a third of it CPU, a third of it the North Bridge,
right,
and all that, the PCI Express, and then the next third of it the graphics, and Intel is like 50% CPU, 25% graphics, and other 25% the Encore type crap.
Right. The model numbers, in case you're interested, will be branded as AMD Vision, so there'll be different tiers. They have the A8, A6, and A4 lineup of processors, which, of course, mean that they will be better than the Core i7, i5, and i3 series of processors. The A8 and A6 will be quad-core processors. They will differ by the Radeon core count, 400 and 320, respectively. And then the A4 will be a dual-core with 240 shader processors, obviously lower power, lower cost, all those types of things.
Well, we haven't seen exact prices, but we're talking $600-700, right?
Yeah, so these systems are going to be in the, maybe as low as 500, probably as high as 800 or 900, depending on what kind of discrete graphics maybe they want to put in or whatever, other features will go into a notebook. But yes, this is very much mainstream notebook oriented, and it's going to definitely targeting Core i3 and Core i5. Core i7 is going to be a little bit outside of its performance area there, right? But with the graphics tests, the A8 APU actually still does better than it. It's when we look at the processor side of things that really it kind of goes weighted to one side. Obviously, since we're talking about a notebook here, one of the important factors is the battery life. If you look at our AMD, we tested the A8 3500M processor. It was actually able to get 7.5 hours during the battery eater readers test, which is I think one of the longest we've ever had on our systems. So it's a very impressive battery life. It's been able to meet or beat what Intel's Core i5 has been able to do in quite a few of our reviews that we've done. Almost all of our reviews have been of either Sandy Bridge-based notebooks or some of the latest Atom and Fusion-based E-series notebooks. So that's impressive from a battery life standpoint, right? This is the main area where AMD has been behind in these mainstream notebooks. Now they've actually been able to catch up. So these notebooks, HP announced, I don't know, like 7 or 11 or something like that on the day of release. They'll start to be available here towards the later part of June, maybe early July. So I think AMD has a very successful story to tell in the notebook front. It'll be maybe not next week, but the week after we'll be able to talk about the desktop front and if consumers and gamers and end users are going to want to build systems based on Llano. I think based on what we saw on this front, of CPU performance being low, GPU performance being great for an integrated part, that it might make sense for home theaters and your mom and dad type of machine, but maybe not as much for anybody that's doing any hardcore processing or gaming. But we'll be able to talk more about that in the future. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on this whole kind of Llano launch based on the mobile technology that we have thus far, as opposed to what we are expecting to see in the desktop front.
If I was in a financial situation, I would say, Ryan, let me add a little bit more color to what you're saying here.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, AMD has done some interesting things here. First of all, it's the core is more, the CPU core is more akin to the Athlon 2. It doesn't have any L3 cache, but they have done several things to improve performance over the Athlon 2, and a lot of that has to do with some of the front end stuff. The memory controller got a huge tweak. We'll talk about that in a second, and they've also increased the L2 cache to 1 meg a piece. So you still got a chip that's quad core, and it's got 4 megs of L2 cache, so that helps out quite a bit. They expect around 6% improvement per clock than what we have seen previously with like the Athlon 2. So I mean, it's still not a terrible performing processor by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not as good as what Intel has out with Sandy Bridge. I mean, what they have done with that is just tremendous. It's a really great processor architecture, and we can only hope that one day that AMD will get close to matching them again. But still, when you look at the the mobile sector that they're really aiming this to, where you've got a little bit better margins than on the desktop side, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, they can push all these out on the GlobalFoundries 32-nanometer process. They're going to have a... Pardon?
I was saying I forgot to mention that this is the first
this is
GlobalFoundries
32-nanometer
GPU,
part, and they, like as you were saying, that their power consumption is right up there with the best of what Intel has. They do have a more balanced architecture in terms of where we're going to put the transistors at. What is most important when you look at how well this processor scores in like the the HQV high definition type applications and benchmarks as compared to the Intel, and then you've got on top of that all of the the APU stuff, which uses the GPU, OpenCL, and I mean that's just right attached right there. So you also have really pretty decent transcoding. You have other effects that can be done in real time in video. The one effect that they're really proud of is the non-shaky cam type playback. Yeah. They were talking about that and saying, if you want to watch 2 minutes of YouTube video that's not shaky, you basically have to, on the Intel processor, download that video or somehow take it, re-encode it with the anti-shaking stuff, and then play it back, and that's going to take 7 minutes of your time. I mean, it's just... there are little things that they're doing well. In terms of the memory controller, they have beefed it up. If we look at current generation quad-core processors, they really only take 8 to 12 gigabytes per second of bandwidth at any one time if they're really maxed out. Now, that's one thing that we've kind of complained about and said, Intel has this triple-channel DDR3 controller in their high-end i7s, and we're seeing upwards of 22 to 24 gigabytes per second. AMD can't keep up with that. Well, when you actually look at how streaming works and how these companies have really worked on their core architectures so that they're not as reliant on main memory accesses. I mean, both of them, at the max, how much of a performance difference do we see between Sandy Bridge, which only has dual channel, as compared to the last generation i7? I mean, in many ways, the Sandy Bridge is a little bit faster, even though it's got supposedly less memory bandwidth, and that's just because these CPUs are I mean, they're not starved for bandwidth. Now, you throw a high performance GPU on there, and suddenly you've got something that's going to eat as much bandwidth as you have, and having a 400 Radeon Core product that's on a CPU, it's going to eat that bandwidth. And so, as we will probably see later in the next couple of weeks, we can really see how scaling the bandwidth on these products can really improve performance, because the CPUs are not starved by any means for bandwidth, but these GPUs certainly are. So
definitely,
don't pay attention to the stream numbers as much as you used to, because you're not going to see where most of that bandwidth is going with, like, SciSoft or Everest or any of these other ones that do streaming to the CPU, because the majority of this bandwidth is going to be going to the GPU at any kind of performance. So, Yeah, I think AMD has it's got a competitive product because it is a little bit more balanced. I mean, you still get a quad-core CPU that can still do well in things like video encoding, professional applications, and whatnot. It's not as good as what Intel has, but boy, the graphics, not only are they faster, but they fully support DirectX 11. They have all kinds of little nice things like non-angle dependent anisotropic filtering. So
right,
you have
things you wouldn't get otherwise.
Yeah.
You get better image quality out of the AMD product than you're going to get with the Intel, and you can actually utilize those. You can use 2x or 4x AA depending on the application and the quality levels. So yeah, this is a really big step for AMD, and I don't think people may realize how big it is or why people are as excited about it is. But as we go towards more visual computing, I mean, CPU is still going to be important, but hey, you've still got a quad core sitting in the middle of your laptop. It's allowing you 7 to 8 hours of pretty good productive use out of it. And even though 1.5 gigahertz, or I think the top end is 1.7 gigahertz, that's still it's still nothing to spit at. So it's going to be interesting times for the rest of this year.
Yep. So there's a lot more information if you go look at our review. It was posted on June, 10th or 11th, 12th, something like that. A lot more details on the architecture, information, benchmarks, that kind of stuff. Go check that out. We've kind of rambled on a little bit too long about that on the podcast. The other thing we wanted to get to is also AMD-oriented. This is information we gleaned from the AMD Fusion Developer Summit. It was kind of an interesting a venue for them. This is kind of the first time that AMD has been forthcoming with information about next-generation architectures, and they really talked about they're really lining up the rest of their APU lineup for the next 3 years. They didn't give product details, they didn't give specs or clock speeds or anything like that, but they talked about the architectural changes that they had planned, that they're planning on taking, that are going to take place from now for the next 3 years. And it includes things like, user mode scheduling, unified address space between CPU and GPU, GPU graphics preemption, and all of this type of thing is built into a product called the Fusion System Architecture, and it's basically AMD remapping the way computers, it might be too much to say remap the way computers function as a whole, but it's completely re-architecting how these two processors are going to be interoperable inside the operating system, who can preempt what, who can address what inside which one's memory space and that kind of stuff. So they talked a lot about what their plans are for that. But even more interesting, I think, for the immediate is they talked a lot about the GPU architecture that will be coming later this year, which is somewhat of a surprise, in the Southern Islands GPU. We've probably heard the code name said on this podcast quite a few times. But it's kind of an interesting change. Now, Josh, you wrote up an editorial kind of analyzing what they are doing here. They're basically, if you're used to hearing about terms like VLIW, we moved from VLIW 5 to VLIW 4, going from the 5000 and 6800 series to the Cayman architecture and the 6900 series of Radeons. No longer are we doing a VLIW architecture. Instead, we're going to a vector-based architecture that they are still calling like a vector plus scaler, and a new device or new node of this GPU called a compute unit. So what about this really stands out the most? What are the key points that you think really make this different from what AMD has done in, the last decade?
Well, the key point to all of this is that it really made my head hurt when I was watching the streaming video and trying to figure out what the hell they were talking about. Because
yes. You should have been there in person.
Kind of dense stuff. Eric Deemers was up there talking about it, and literally it took me 3 good listens and a lot of reading and going over some forum stuff that some people have listed. And it's a pretty big change architecturally for AMD. Back when we were in the X1800 and the X1900 series, I believe that these were all VLIW 5 type things, except they didn't have the type of computational ability of DX10 and DX11 parts. I mean, this was all totally DX9. It was very, very good for those type of applications because essentially they had a support for, one clock, a VEC4 plus scalar result, and now you can see why, it's kind of called VLI 5. As we have gone away from the pure graphics workloads, VLI 5 has made less and less sense because you're having more computation in there, you're having tessellation, geometry, shading, things like that, which are not like a VEC4 plus scalar product. And so some of these inside, these stream units were being unused to a pretty impressive degree. I think that they figured out that in a DirectX 11 type application, their last VLI 5, VLI W5 processes, 3.6 of them were active at any one time, and so you've got a pretty significant portion that are just sitting around doing nothing, and that degrades overall performance. Now, with the Cayman, they went to the VLI W4, which they were able to. It's a little bit easier to compile, a little bit easier to schedule, and it kept the shader units at a higher ratio of just being at work.
Utilization.
Utilization. So with this new CU compute unit, they're kind of throwing VLI W4 and 5 out the window, and they're going more for a Fermi. But this is still very much unlike Fermi, but it's a little bit more closer to it because they don't have kind of these more strict structures. Instead, it's a small scalar unit that handles a lot of the stranger codes. It handles pointers, some transcendentals, stuff like that. And then they've got 4 16-wide vector units that do the majority of the work. They have a bunch more L1 and L2 cache in there,
right.
Scheduling and communications between the different units is much improved. The L2 cache is fully coherent. You can just go on and on about the technical details because, let me tell you, there's a lot, and you should probably read the article to get a little bit better idea of it.
Definitely.
But essentially, you are looking at a total redesign that still is going to be very, very strong in graphics, but it's going to be a big jump for AMD in the compute type market. So they're also pushing a couple of other bigger things, as you had mentioned, fully unified virtual memory with the CPU. So they use these x86 64-based pointers for virtual memory, and so they share that same space. They can kind of tell each other what to do and what they need. And, in a perfect world, you have this really cohesive utilization of both processor and the GPU to be able to offload, whatever processes that would be better done by the other. And this is, very important in compute. You get these, serial things that the CPU can do really, really well, and then you get these highly parallel loads that the GPU can do. And so they're really, really pushing for this unification, this heterogeneous computing. And so this is a big, huge step for AMD. And again, we're going to see the first generation of this in the Southern Isles, and that's going to be out sometime in Q4 of this year, basically as soon as TSMC can get their 28-nanometer process up to snuff, and we'll see about that.
Yep.
But, and again, over the next 3 years, we're going to see this integrated eventually into, the lower-end GPUs, and then we're going to see it on the APUs. I think that, right now, obviously, it's the 5000 series that we see on the current Llano. I believe that they kind of let slip that the first Trinity APU is going to be based on the Cayman, which is the VLI 4, VLI W4. And then after that, we can expect, this new CU unit to be integrated on the CPU parts probably a year after that. So we're looking at, 3 years of better integration, a lot of work on the stuff that you can't see, namely, like getting the virtual memory to work on the AMD CPUs and getting OS support for that, as that's very, very important to getting into work. So, I mean, AMD is now, I mean, they're really catching up. I mean, NVIDIA blazed the trail with their CUDA. They really wanted to have a lot of compute. They figured this is the best way that we can compete going forward. AMD was a little bit slower in that, but, I mean, they still did it. But their priority was, 1, good graphics, 2, get the damn GPU on a CPU, and 3, stay afloat against Intel, who's really hard to do that against. So, as you can see, they were not big into the compute and OpenCL areas, and they're starting to change that now because now they have a very competitive architecture with Llano and Brazos. So, yeah, they're going to see a lot more. It looks like it's going to be a good architecture. It's going to scale nicely. It's not as compiler heavy as the previous VLIW 4 and 5s were, so it's a little bit easier to program for. They should get better performance right off the bat, even with kind of brand new drivers, and so these are going to be some real positive things for AMD. Now we just got to see where they're going to clock them at, what kind of performance per watt we're going to expect, especially against the next generation Fermi architecture from Nvidia. So yeah, we're going to be a lot of interesting things coming up soon.
And the good news is we won't have to wait long to really see how these perform. They're saying they're going to ship this year. We are almost basically in the second half of the year already, so we assume we'll start to see information on parts on them sometime in Q3. But Josh did a really good job on the write-up there. If you go to the website, look for the AMD Fusion System Architecture Overview, Southern Isle GPUs and beyond, if you are interested in that really geeky type of stuff. And for all the detail and all the technical information that they gave us, there's so much more to learn about what this GPU will do. We're basically just learning about a single compute unit. We have no idea how they're interconnect and what kind of memory backend they're going to have and all this other type of stuff. There's all kinds of information that can still be trickled out by AMD if they wanted to do that. So we're going to jump into a collection of news, also some more from the AFDS show, and then some other interesting tidbits from the last couple of weeks as well. First, we'll take a quick break here and thank today's podcast sponsor. All right, MSI, thank you for that. Josh mentioned this when we were going through the Fusion System Architecture article, and that was about Trinity. And that at the AMD Fusion Developer Summit, it kind of let slip that the Trinity APU, which is the next iteration of desktop processor and I guess mobility mainstream processor that will be released as a CPU-GPU combo from AMD called Trinity, will actually use the VLIW4 Cayman architecture. And that's kind of interesting because it kind of removes any speculation about whether or not next year's APU will actually have begun to integrate this compute unit-based Southern Isles type architecture. That does not seem to be the case. So it looks like we're on like a 12-month to 18-month cadence between discrete GPU integration and APU integration. Although Eric did say, the AMD CTO did point out that their whole goal is to compress that cadence time, right? They want to compress that time between discrete to APU, although they know that they're still probably always going to need that APU or that GPU to APU time lapse there in order to get the technology right and that kind of stuff. Pretty interesting there. Also, we did see Trinity demoed for the first time as well. During one of the keynote sessions, they had a Trinity-based notebook computer up and running. Wasn't doing anything really special. Wasn't even playing any games. It was running Windows 7 and playing back a video, playing back a movie. But considering we are still, I mean, this was shown on the day of Llano's launch. We're about a year away from that release. That's pretty good news for Silicon Run-Up and the fact that they have technology that they're capable of showing off already. So that was good news there. I remember when we were discussing the Fusion Developer Summit, one of the things that I think was interesting to a lot of people was the fact that ARM was going to be there. They were going to be a speaker at the AMD Fusion Developer Summit. Many people thought, well, that's kind of weird because ARM is a direct competitor to AMD. They make microprocessors. They license their processor technology to a lot of people, and AMD obviously designs and sells microprocessors. Now, I guess if you look at it today, these are not direct competitors because honestly, AMD doesn't have anything that's going to compete in the ARM market or vice versa. But in the future, I imagine both companies are eyeing each other's markets pretty closely. ARM wants to get into the desktop front, maybe even server front, if NVIDIA's Project Denver is to be believed. And then AMD is obviously going to try to make smaller and lower power Fusion-based APUs to get down into tablets and I don't know, maybe even cell phones at one point in the future as well. So seeing Jim Davies, who's the VP of Technology at ARM, get up on stage was kind of a question. Was AMD and ARM going to announce some kind of big sponsorship or were they going to merge? That was the farthest stuff out there. Was there going to be some big announcement? The answer was unfortunately no. And instead, what they talked about was basically they went through a lot of the same ARM pitch that they do most of the time. Here's why lower power is better. Here's why the frequency uplift per node over years has fallen off. This is why our designs have always been right from the beginning. One of the interesting things that they talked about, Josh, I don't know if you have any speculation on this, was something called dark silicon, which is even though we could make smaller and smaller processors as we go from 45 to 22 to 11 nanometers, the problem is we can only power up so much of that silicon at any one time, given the current power draw that is capable in that smaller of an area. They call it dark silicon, and it's basically, as it quotes here, refers to the huge swaths of silicon transistors on future chips that will be underused because there's not enough power to utilize all of the transistors at the same time. As the process tech gets smaller, the areas of dark silicon increase until the area of the die can be utilized at one time hits as low as 10% in 2020. And it's because of that, the need to design chips with many task-specific heterogeneous portions is crucial, and both AMD and ARM are on that track. So that's kind of an interesting justification, I guess, for the heterogeneous computing, other than the fact that you get performance advantages, is that you're able to make more complex chips and put more capability on those chips without running into these power walls.
Yeah, and part of that is there's some assumptions going on here, and especially about materials. One thing that Intel has done is in these 3D FinFETs that help to mitigate some of these issues that Jim was talking about. And we're going to see other things with fully depleted SOI, other kind of structures and materials that are going to be used to make those predictions a little bit less dire than what Jim was talking about. But, what he is saying is essentially there's a physical wall here between what we can power with, this kind of current and expect this many hours out of, and, heat, and all these other things that when you're talking handheld devices are, of supreme importance. So it's going to be interesting to see how these guys handle, it's not just when something is idle. We're going to have a much finer granularity in power gating than we ever have had before. But, I mean,
right.
That's kind of like saying, every picture of me is when I was younger. I mean, it's just an obvious thing. And
right.
So this is, going forward, I mean, all of these guys are going to be doing, not just materials, but also design structures that will help to, mitigate all of this dark silicon. But there are going to be times when you're going to be powering down significant portions of the CPU, even in the middle of computation. So it's going to be interesting to see where design and materials go from here on forward. I mean, it's not
right.
as much of an issue right now because, NVIDIA's coming out with their Cal-L processor later this summer that not only has double the graphics, but double the CPU cores. But they're already talking, hey, we've learned enough about this architecture. We've, learned enough about TSMC and the 40-nanometer process that this chip, even though it's double of everything, it's going to be doing the same kind of power draw. It's also going to have the same kind of longevity in terms of battery life as our current Tegra 2. So this is a good example of design getting around a lot of these power issues.
Agreed. The last kind of bit of news I thought we should talk about here from the Fusion Developer Summit was Microsoft's announcement of C++ AMP, which stands for Accelerated Massive Parallelism, is essentially a C++ add-on, C++ extension to Visual Studio and the C++ programming language to help developers take advantage of highly parallel and heterogeneous computing environments of today and the future. So essentially, this is creating a competitor to OpenCL. OpenCL has long been touted as the programming language of choice for people that want to have the ability to take advantage of CPU processing, GPU processing, and whatever else we're able to have in the future. So much like we have OpenGL and DirectX, and then we have C++ and all these other programming languages on the standard computing platforms, C++ AMP is going to be an alternative now to OpenCL, but with the weight of Microsoft behind it. And also interesting, unlike C#, which if you're in the development world, you know as a kind of like Microsoft proprietary language, C++ AMP will have a chance to be a dominant standard because they're actually opening it up. They're going to allow other compilers other than Visual Studio to take advantage of this technology and be able to compile this code. And AMD obviously wanted these guys on hand because they wanted to show how heterogeneous computing is taking off, and this is a Fusion Developer Summit, right? This is not really a media event. This wasn't really for hardware vendors. This was all about getting these software developers interested and excited in programming for these types of models. And Microsoft went up on stage and demoed basically a physics simulation running on just quad-core APU or quad-core CPU portion of an APU, and then on CPU and GPU, and then the discrete GPU, and then discrete GPU with the APU, and then dual GPUs, dual discrete plus the APU. I mean, they were able to show that all this running off a single executable file can run and compile on all these different devices. 5800 series cards, the Fusion parts, Llano, I think was what they were using in demo. So, it's very. This is what's necessary for us to get applications that will really take advantage of this heterogeneous computing. Whether or not you wanted to call it GPU computing, if you're Nvidia, heterogeneous computing, if you're AMD, and I don't really know what you call it if you're Intel right now, but
Larrabee.
Yeah, that's true. It's just interesting to me. I mean, how many times have we talked about video transcoding and video transcoding? And
more often than I've done it.
Video transcoding, right. I mean, when you talk about GPU and taking advantage of the performance of the APU, it's like, well, we can transcode this, and then we can do other types of things. We can correct your videos, like you talked about the AMD Steady Video technology, and there are V-Reveal software that does that same type of thing using GPUs. But there's no, other than that, there still hasn't been either a category or really some instances of GPU-based applications or applications that will take advantage of all of this processing. And I think folding at home is one. But again, it's not like a mainstream kind of thing. And it's going to take these tools to be around for a little while and developers to learn how to use them before we see that. Before, even just doing something very basic, they're going to go ahead and take advantage of the GPU horsepower just because they can and it's easy to do, right? And that's what it needs to be for these developers. It needs to be easy. Up until this point, it hasn't been very easy. So even though if you're not interested in programming, if you're not interested in the semantics of what C++ AMP is, you should be glad that there is now another competitor and another option to OpenCL that will help bring these types of things forward. So I think Josh and I have been talking a lot. Let's see, is Jeremy and Alan? Are you guys still even on the podcast? I mean,
yep.
Did you hang up on us?
Al did come back. Good.
He always comes back.
X79 now.
Yeah, Alan, tell us a little about the X79 chipset and how super awesome it is.
Yeah, actually, especially if it can support both of those socket types, right? It's supposed to.
Yeah, right.
Well, I don't know. It's supposed to be able to support the 1366 and the 2011.
Which is this big, and then the 2011, which is like this big.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, if it can do it, that's, it's well, okay. think about it this way. The socket may not necessarily, you can't just like plug in the other chip, right? We've come to that consensus?
Correct.
I can't see it.
Okay. So unless that's sort of some miracle that somehow happens, which is probably not, the advantage is that it keeps the cost low from the manufacturing standpoint because you're not re-engineering the entire, manufacturers don't have to tool towards, oh my God, this is a completely different chipset, right? Yeah, some of the lines are different, the socket's different, but everything else for that chipset is going to be the same, right? Because there'd just be some lines that you would either use for this one socket or you'd use these other lines for this other socket, and there's probably some, configuration bit they throw just to tell the chipset which one they're, they've hardwired. And, yeah, and then you could have that Asus, was it Asus, that monstrosity thing that we saw from...
Yeah, Don Shui.
that weird board. Now, was that...
No.
That wasn't an X79 board, though.
No, it was just a weird dual core.
They didn't really say. I assume it had to have been, especially now that we know that chipset will technically be able to support both processor types.
Yeah, which is also cool, right? That the chipset's that flexible that it's able to do that. Yeah. I mean, take it for what it's worth. It should, and end users, we're not going to see, just guy buying a motherboard. Okay. It's going to be this chipset with this socket or this chipset with this other socket.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, no idea what their naming scheme is going to be on that to try to keep those separate. So you don't just say, I need an X79 motherboard. But it's kind of interesting to see this. It's not really backwards compatibility for the consumer. It's like backwards compatibility for motherboard vendors, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't really know. So it's somewhat
Well,
interesting.
remember when DDR2 first came out? And like the DDR first came out. Like Asus put out the A7A 266, which had SDRAM and DDR. And you couldn't mix and match them, but you could use one or to other.
Yes.
So I could see that as, hey, you've only got X number of dollars, so here's a brand new motherboard. Still does triple channel RAM. Still supports everything that your old i7 did, the 1366. So you can pop it in there. Get some brand new features because, I mean, the boards we're seeing that are X58 that have support for SATA 6G and USB 3 native are few and far between, tend to be higher-end $200-$300 motherboards.
Yes.
Also, what I haven't seen yet is if these X79s are going to support SRT. The assumption is it will. Why wouldn't Intel put it in there?
That would be a massive screw-up.
Yeah, why wouldn't you put it in there? So all of a sudden, you upgrade your motherboard, and now you can use a small SSD as a cache drive for your large hard drive. That's actually an upgrade path you could consider. It's not too bad, and, right now some of the higher-end 1366s are performing about the same as the high-end Sandy Bridge that we've seen, the 2600K.
Right.
And the 2011 socket, well, it's going to be a little bit of a wait. This motherboard, on the other hand, may be coming out fairly soon.
Agreed. You also posted something up, Jeremy, about something about Microsoft laughing as Nvidia's getting bought. What is this story? This was kind of interesting. This is something that happened last week, I guess, that we never really addressed. And something came up. Was this about Microsoft like having an option to buy Nvidia or something like that?
Well, we did sort of cover it. What the problem is that Microsoft is sort of the kingmaker for any deal that Nvidia makes, where if Nvidia is going to sell over 50% of its shares, Intel gets first and last right of refusal. So they can say right off the bat, no, it's not going to happen, or they can let them spend the millions of dollars to do a deal, and they've got a company that's going to buy Nvidia, and Nvidia's all happy, and all the stockbrokers are happy, and at the very last minute after all the money is spent, Microsoft can say, no, and they can't be sold. But now what we're seeing is, there's a bit of a soap opera that's always going on behind the scenes with these companies, and if you look at it sort of with that idea in mind, you sort of see it happening. So in this case, you've got a rep from AMD, the CFO, whose name is Soban. Where's
Spock?
Leslie Soban, VP of Product and Platform Marketing at AMD, is saying that There is no way Intel will ever buy Nvidia. And, the logic behind it is fairly smart. AMD bought ATI to get a hold of the intellectual property. It wasn't that, we need to sell Radeons right this second. It's, we need to get hold of this fairly mature graphical architecture, and we need to squish it into our CPU somehow. And we're going to make sure that, most of it is GPU, a bit of it's CPU, and we'll call it APU, and it will be amazing, and it'll be something no one's really seen before, at least done in this way, sort of like AMD did dual cores differently. They didn't glue two together. They built it from the ground up to be a dual core. Intel, on the other hand, well, they've already got combined GPU and CPU, and they've already put it to market, and so far, after, a motherboard vendor oopsie, everyone loves it. So they don't really need to get a hold of Nvidia for being able to combine an existing GPU into an existing CPU. What does make me sort of wonder as to whether or not Microsoft is going, no, I think we've still got a chance to screw over Intel pretty good here, is the mobile market. Adams, the GPU support is just abysmal. They actually have to depend on Nvidia to provide it with Ion.
Right.
Yeah. So Nvidia, on the other hand, has now got Tegra and Tegra 2 coming in. We're looking at some significant jumps in performance on mobile platforms compared to anything, because we haven't seen much in the way of that ultra-low power Sandy Bridge. We haven't really even heard much about Intel working on it. There's not even the rumors floating around. So if Intel just bought McAfee not too long ago, wants built-in AV on a chip, and, if you can install AV on a PC, that doesn't make much sense. If you're buying a cell phone and want to be protected but don't want to install your security apps, all of a sudden you're wondering, is Intel sort of eyeing Nvidia? They've already been working together with Ion and Atom, that maybe, they might be interested in it. And the other thing is the high-powered or the high-performance computing. Intel, up until earlier this week, which is sort of the next topic that we'll touch on, hadn't really heard much from them about HPC, about slaving GPUs into just seriously scalar processors. Larrabee, well, we've been making jokes about that almost as long as we've been making jokes about Duke Nukem. But, all of a sudden, maybe there is still something here. AMD has said things before that flat out said this will never happen, and, well, they sort of said that, it was a joke when they said that Intel would have to buy Nvidia to get into GPUs. Well, a couple of years down the road and a bunch of something to Microsoft to make them say, okay, this deal can go on, it might happen, but sort of for the exact opposite reason that it happened for AMD buying ATI.
So it's interesting because that does kind of transition into this story. First of all, just a little bit of it really annoys me when people say that Larrabee was never dead and blah, 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 so that kind of stuff. If you actually thought when Intel said that they were canceling the Larrabee project that we would never see it again, you obviously didn't finish reading their press release, because they always talked about this kind of coming to fruition. So apparently they had some information come out. I guess they actually had, based on this picture that Bert just put on the screen, they actually had a press conference talking about Knight's Corner, right? Does anybody know any more about this technology? What exactly they showed off? It was a 50-core x86-based processor?
Well, that was the old 36 one. That was Knight's Ferry. We haven't seen a Knight's Bridge card yet. Or Knight's Corner, sorry.
But still, it's a 16 wide vector unit attached to each x86 core, and they can provide a tremendous amount of gigaflops that just,
So, if I'm
it was originally a Pentium. Larrabee was a Pentium.
It was essentially a Pentium 1 core that they kind of optimized. It's still out of order, single core each one, but the programming model for it is very, very simple, and Yeah, it's going to be an interesting product if they can get it out in 22 nanometer in a fairly reasonable amount of time, and considering that they're on the verge of doing 22 nanometer by January of 2012, it shouldn't be that long before we see Intel going into more of the GPU and the areas where...
I'm sorry, I was going to say this is kind of the first time they've released like specs and information about it. So they say Knight's Corner will be able to run x86-based software, features 50 cores based on 22 nanometer process. As you were saying, each core will run 4 threads at 1.2 gigahertz, have 8 megs of cache, and will be supported by a 512-bit vector processing unit. And the predecessor Knight's Ferry was 32 45 nanometer cores, and 8 contained in a Xeon server capable of 7.4 teraflops. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, what you're looking at there with the new one, the Knight's Corner, is a Xeon core, not an old Pentium core. It's 22 nanometer, and it's going to be the first time we see the Tri-Gate come out. That is what the Tri-Gate transistor is probably going to first appear as, is one of these Knight's Corner cards.
Really?
That's what they're saying.
The next generation Ivy Bridge stuff would be the first.
Well, 22 nanometer. If they're basing this on 22 nanometer silicon, that is next gen. So all of a sudden, it's like, what is this card going to be able to do?
I think it's going to have a nice blue heatsink cooler on it.
Yeah,
won't need one.
Very attractive shroud.
Shroud? Was it a very attractive shroud?
No, I would never say such a thing. Are you kidding me?
It does look very AMD-ish, though.
Well, I guess it's hard to cool a GPU, what is essentially a GPU in any kind of other fashion. Yeah. So we'll look into some more of that as well. Hopefully, I know we'll hear much more about it here in September when we roll up on Intel Developer Forum, which is always a really, really good show. So we'll keep an eye out for that. I'm sure we'll hear more about it before then, too. Other kind of interesting news floating around the web. I won't talk too much about this. BAPCO, why benchmarking matters or doesn't. Charlie over at Semi-Accurate came out with a story a couple of days ago talking about AMD, V, and Nvidia all leaving BAPCO, which, if you don't know what BAPCO is, I believe that stands for Business Applications Performance Corporation. Basically, they were supposed to be an outlet to create independent, open source, not really open source, but open initiative benchmarks so that people like HP and all these Dell and these companies and then businesses and governments and educational foundations could test hardware against each other, find what they wanted, and have this benchmark that was easy to run, very comprehensive, and it would, since it was open, it was supported by AMD and Intel, Nvidia and AMD and ATI, that it was fair. Well, apparently everybody left but Intel pretty much, and the reason is that the BAPCO Sysmark 2012 benchmark came out and it just nobody liked what it did. In particular, some of the quotes from the email, or rather the blog post by Nigel DeSalle from AMD, said that SM 2012 is marketed as rating performance using 18 applications and 390 measurements. The reality is only 7 applications and less than 10% of the total measurements dominate the overall score. So a small class of operations across the entire benchmark influence the overall score. And in fact, a relatively large portion of the Sysmark 2012 score is based on system performance rated during optical character recognition and file compression activities, things an average user will rarely, if ever, do. There's a lot of validity to that, and based on all the speculation going around about suggestions that AMD has made and Nvidia have made and VIA have made towards what this benchmark should do and how it should operate, and a lot of these things get overridden by Intel. I don't really know I don't understand how that happens in what's supposed to be like a 1 vote per company panel type of thing, unless it's a 1 vote per dollar type of thing, which is, if it's the case, is obviously a very big problem. A lot of people were kind of, just blasting away at Intel and BAPCO for this, and I completely understand all that. But My issue is here, as I say, that too many people in the industry, including the OEMs, governments, educational outlets that buy parts from Intel, AMD, Nvidia, and all these guys, and reviewers that run a single test on a notebook and call it a day are just really lazy. So Sysmark, very synthetic, very one-sided. If we looked at Intel's Sysmark score, Sysmark CPU benchmark versus AMD's Llano CPU benchmark, obviously it puts a huge advantage to Intel's side, but nobody's calling for Sysmark's removal. And why is that? And the reason is because so many people depend on or are currently depending on Bapco's Sysmark suite test as their only outlet of information. And I think that's the part that annoys me the most is that people should be reading quality sites like PC Perspective or AnonTech or Hard OCP or any of these other websites that are out there that do legitimate testing and benchmarking. You know, we use many benchmarks and pieces of software to give you an overall goal. Imagine if you did graphics card review and all we looked at was 3D Mark Vantage, right? Guess what? It happens, right? So that's probably how Dell picks which graphics card they're going to put in their system. It's probably what HP does. And the same thing happens with CPUs and entire platforms based on this Bapco Sysmark stuff. So I think it's okay to chastise what Bapco and Intel are doing in this case, but I think more what I think should be done is this kind of what I call a campaign of education based on telling people what benchmarks do what, how they should be analyzed, what benchmarks do for different capabilities of what a user actually interacts with. This is what makes reviewing so difficult. That's why people like Josh get paid so much money.
So much money, and they send me all this free software too. Look at all my Bapco software.
Yeah,
of course it's still WebMark 2004 and Sysmark 2002, but yeah. Also, something to notice is that none of these are actually out of their shrink wrap.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It was one of those things that got me. It's like, okay, I understand that it's bad if you just run this and go about your day. But if you run, I don't have a problem if people use Sysmark 2012 in their benchmark suite, as long as it's not the only thing they're going to show me, right? It takes running multiple tests. It takes discussing what those results were. If we had Alan run HDTAC and that was it in our storage tests, how informative would that be? But yet, how many reviews do we see that do exactly that, right? I mean,
yeah.
You've got to have multiple pieces of information. You've got to have
multiple.
Go
buy the crucial C300.
Exactly.
Do it. Yeah. It's so fast. So fast.
I mean, how many different storage benchmarks do we use, Alan?
Oh, Jesus. I run like 6 other ones on top of what we publish. So I run like 15. No, they're not even fit for consumption. It's stuff that to evaluate the drive properly, that's stuff that only really I can interpret what the heck the numbers are. Stuff that I made, basically.
Interesting.
Anyway, I've never had such an urge to get on Cheeseburger Network to say artificial benchmark is artificial. It's just a picture.
And that's fine. We use artificial benchmarks. We use Sysmark. We use 3D Mark Vantage. We use them as individual data points in a larger field of information, and then we attempt to explain it to you. Sometimes it's difficult to do because sometimes these data points are doing very different things, and it's like looking at Llano. If you encode things in Handbrake all day, it's not going to be that great. But if you want to play Left 4 Dead 2, you can be able to do it longer on the battery on AMD system, and it's going to have better frame rate. You know, those types of things. So anyway, if you see some people complaining about that, read our editorial instead at PCPro.com, of course. One last bit of information. Piece of news was posted just as we're recording this. Crysis 2, DirectX 11, and high-res texture pack will apparently be out next week. DX 11 patch will include things like tessellation, high-quality HDR motion blur, realistic shadows, sprite-based something, bokeh, depth of field. I don't know if that's a misspelling on our point.
Sprite-based, that'd be awesome.
Sprite-based, I love it. Collision detection, woo!
Parallax, occlusion mapping, things like that. So it's actually maybe will help people want to buy Crysis 2 or play it. No promises, I guess, but there's some information for you. And now, to finish off our section before we get into our hardware software picks of the week, Alan is going to show us a fancy schmancy piece of hardware that he is just itching to tell us about but can't yet, right? So this is something we actually saw at Computex, Alan?
Yes, we saw it at Computex. Well, you saw it on Computex.
I saw it. Ken and I saw it. You were not there.
Yes, I was not there because I have to jump through extra hoops to fly to that country.
Indeed.
Anyhow.
Got arrested there once.
No. It's like a security. Anyhow. So yeah, let me grab the webcam
nuclear weapons. Nuclear vessels.
Yeah. So we saw one at, you saw one at Computex, and it wasn't running, and it was sitting on a board, like nailed to it or something, and I have one plugged into a board right now that's actually running. So, hey.
What is that? What are we looking at there?
The Revo 3 X2, and if the webcam would cooperate, which it's not going to.
X2, eh?
Well, it's okay. So it's like the previous Revo, where they made an X2, and they basically just used that daughter board. The original one only had 2 SandForce controllers on it behind a silicon image RAID chip, and then the X2 just tacked on a little daughter card, made it a double stacked board, and then that gave it another couple of SandForce controllers plugged in. So because that silicon image controller was a 4-channel controller, so it seemed kind of silly to have 4-channel controller. You're only using 2, and there's this nifty little port sitting on the board, almost as if they were expecting to be able to throw an extra card on there. Same deal with this, and it's going to work the same way supposedly. Like they're probably going to sell a Revo 3, and they'll probably sell a Revo 3 X2, right? The difference here is that the controller, not the SandForce controllers, but the controller on the board that handles the RAID is, well, for one, it's 4-lane PCI Express. I think it pushes like 5 gigabits per second, something crazy like that. So whatever it is, that controller it's using the good PCI Express spec, right? If you're getting 5 gigabits per second over just 4 lanes, right?
Right.
So we're still sort of tooling around with it. I've spent the entire first half of the podcast fighting with the motherboard to get it to see it. Turns out we had to update to the absolute newest BIOS. Anyhow, no, the one from last month it's not new enough, guys. Sorry, you need to be brand new for this. So with the new controller, it uses some new tech, which I can't go into crazy detail on right now, but it's supposed to be sort of like how an SSD separates your sectors, your physical sectors, or at least sectors that the OS sees from actual spots on the flash. Mm-hmm. Well, this controller is supposed to do that again on its level before it even gets to the So the idea there is that whereas a solid-state drive controller does that in effect to try to combine writes and optimize where you're writing to on, in terms of flash memory blocks, this controller is going to do the same kind of thing in terms of optimizing if one of the solid-state drives is, say, a little busier than the rest of them because it's writing a little bit more random data than the other ones happen to be writing at this very second, then it can sort of shift that load off to the other guys. So in essence, it's supposed to give you a more sustained high IOs per second type of operation because it's not just a straight RAID. It's not a typical RAID controller where where it does a striping with or just a striping with parity, whatever your RAID mode happens to be. Usually that controller is very dumb, and it just says, okay, I'm just going to put 128K on this drive, and then I'm going to shift to the next and do 128K there, and it just it does a very fixed rotation sort of thing. This controller does not do that, and the whole reason it does that is towards performance, increased performance and abilities. So I'm going to beat up on this thing and see just how fast it'll go.
Punch in the face.
Yes.
Black and blue.
Something else we're looking at, just preview-wise, is
what we got?
Western Digital came out with a different line of I'm holding a 3 terabyte, but there's a Western Digital. It's WD30 EZRX. These drives are out. The EZRX. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's any easier for anything. The acronym doesn't help you there.
Isn't that like ET's cousin?
I guess. But in this case, ET's cousin has a serial ATA 6 gigabit per second interface. So it's a green drive with 6 gigabit per second.
So faster than the glowy finger.
And it has a 64 meg cache, but then again, it's only a green drive. It's only spinning so fast. So really, the only time you're going to see those, much more increased performance is when you have like cache hits, that sort of thing.
Right.
However, one thing I'm going to be going through is back when we benchmarked the Western Digital, what was it, the black? It was a Black Series drive, their first drive that came out. That was only a 1 terabyte drive, but it was serial ATA 6 gigabit, right?
Yeah.
Back when we looked at that, the only solution we had was the Marvell controller, and that controller, even though being 6 gigabit, performed worse than just native Intel chipset 3 gigabit, right? Now we got a new test bed, so while I'm testing this drive, I'm going to bust out some of the other drives we have that are 6 gigabit. And now we can actually test them apples to apples instead of having to rely on a completely different controller, which actually sort of nerfed the performance instead of making it higher. So basically now we can see if the performance actually goes up. Before we had something artificially reducing it. And that's it for storage for now.
All right. Quick reminder here, if you haven't heard about QuakeCon, you probably should. We're going to have a PC Perspective hardware workshop there. Yet again this year, August 4th through the 7th in Dallas, Texas at the Hilton Anatole. Go to QuakeCon.org to register. It's like a 2,000-person PC BYOC gaming LAN event. Very fun. Also, if there's a lot of vendors that are going to be there, and they have different booths and showcases, and you can win a lot of free stuff, and it's a lot of fun. Plus, you get to meet some of us if you're into that type of thing. I don't know.
Drinks on Ryan one night.
Totally. Sodas are awesome, especially if they're free refills. So let's jump into our hardware software picks of the week really quickly. Mine is something that I turned a few people on to while I was out at this most recent convention because I was complaining about running out of space in my Gmail box. Now, I know you're thinking, Ryan, they give you about 8 gigs worth of storage in your Gmail box. How could you possibly run out of data? The issue I have is I uploaded from an Outlook PST files, probably, let's go with 6 or 7 years worth of email. So it was pretty much full, 95% or something like that. Starting to get worried about it. So if you go to findbigmail.com, you will have this little thing where you basically pay this service $5, and it searches through your Gmail account very quickly. And I don't know how it does it, but I don't know. It does it in a way that Gmail interface will never let you do. And it basically will apply labels to your emails of over 100K, over 500K, over 2 megabytes. And then you'll be able to go in and kind of filter through those ones. Let me see what's over 2 megabytes, and then, delete the ones you want to delete. Or if you want to cheat like I did, I just created another Gmail account in our Google Apps service here called Old Email. Nice. And then I just forward all those emails on and delete them. So once you have them filtered, it's very easy to go through and kind of find emails that maybe you don't need anymore, that have a lot of attachments, because it's one of those things that I never really thought about until my space was getting full in there. But there's no way in Gmail to search for the largest emails or to say, what are the biggest emails that have shown up in the last 12 months? What about the previous 12 months, right? There's nothing to that. It's meant for, one of the things in here is Gmail is meant for searching, not for ordering. So something interesting to keep in mind. Or, well, apparently not that either. So that's okay. Now I'm down to like 4 gigs, so I'm totally clear for another couple years. Jeremy, what do you got for us?
Well, nothing that will be seen on eHoarders next week. For those of you who, want to use a more rational way of transferring big files, you've probably run it in Dropbox. You probably had a hell of a surprise this week when Dropbox sort of revealed that for about 4 or 5 hours there, they would accept any password they felt like, and anyone could get at your stuff. It kind of raises some questions.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Enter. Access allowed.
How did you know my password?
It's on your luggage.
He's lol sex.
Spaceballs, damn it.
Same combination I got on my luggage.
Yeah. So there's a nice little link offered here that sort of gives you the basics on encrypting, but also gives a very good warning, which is that encryption is not something you're supposed to be doing while somebody else is trying to read that file. The idea of Dropbox is that someone else is reading the file while you're playing with it, more or less. So you might really want to consider doing a whole bunch of subdirectories, encrypting them one at a time, because as soon as you encrypt it, Dropbox is probably going to get upset and not just make like the small index changes, it's going to have to bring up the entire file again. But seriously, until you can be satisfied that Dropbox is not doing other ridiculous things behind the scenes, or some hackers that have gained a little bit of notoriety lately might not be interested in seeing if their security's up to snuff or not at this point.
Right.
Encrypt your stuff, unless it's the stuff you're sharing on Facebook as well, in which case don't worry about it. Stuff you don't want to share, please encrypt it. That's why you buy the good processor. You don't have to video encode decode.
I knew there was something.
Encryption also requires hefty processing power.
True. Alrighty. Josh.
Me. Excuse me.
Yes.
I fell asleep.
No.
In my beer. It was really nice.
That's good.
Yeah. Anyway, Newegg's got a special right now. You know how much I like anything that is non-TN when it comes to monitors, and my favorite resolution of all time is 1920 by 1200, which is not supported by the vast majority of cheap monitors out there. Well, the HP LP2465 has come back to Newegg. It's $194 for that, but what's even better is that they're bundling it in a combo with the Huey Pantone Pro, and they're giving you $30 away on that entire combo. So it's a really good buy in that you get a really nice monitor with excellent blacks and very good colors and none of the issues of TN. And then you get the Huey Pantone Pro, which can support multiple monitors and get them all to be looking identical.
Yep, we use one of those here. Very handy for multiple monitors if you want them to not have very different color gamuts on either one. So
yeah, so for that amount of money and plus shipping, it's pretty wonderful. It's nice. It's nice.
All right,
it's
Alan.
It's the luxury of monitors and Pantones. Pure luxury.
Alan, you're last. What do you got for us?
So I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right or whatnot, but Lytro, Lytro. Okay, so there's a thing called a light field camera, and it's basically you take whatever the imager is of a camera, you use a different type of lens, you put a bunch of really small spherical type lenses on the face of the actual sensor, so that way you end up with little clusters of pixels that can identify which angle the light's coming in at to the actual CCD or CMOS or whatever the sensor is. Yeah. So between that and the lens combo, you end up being able to take a picture. Granted, the end result is lower resolution than you're not going to get 15 megapixels out of this.
Right.
But depending on how small they can make these micro lenses and how good the tech progresses, you end up with a picture where the data that's in the picture is basically all the contents for all the focal points along the length of the picture. So you end up with a picture that's focused on a certain point, and then if the software is groovy enough or cool enough or whatever you want to call it, like on the Lytro website, they have a picture gallery. You can just click on different parts of the picture, and it's refocusing the end result image picture on different parts of, it.
Yeah, now that I figured that out, that's really cool.
Yeah, you click on the background, and it focuses in the background. And basically, all the data is there.
Right.
It's just a matter of manipulating it in different ways.
I have seen this before, and I believe you could do this same type of thing with a normal camera if you get a lens that has all those spherical lenses on it, and then a piece of software I know I remember this because it was at like a GPU compute. I think it might have been at GTC last year, NVIDIA's global or GPU technology conference. They have a piece of software that will then take your image and cut it, and it'll, like basically instead of like you're saying you have the lenses on the sensors, it sends all of that to the sensor. So the sensor actually reads a bunch of tiny photos, and the software kind of goes through and merges all that data, and so you get something very similar to this, where you had all the focal points available to you at a lower resolution.
And you can do, I mean, if you have a really advanced camera, you can do like a focal bracket sort of thing where the lens is actually, it racks the focus. It goes down, down a range and takes a rapid fire series of pictures, and then you can do whatever you want with that combo, blend them together or whatnot. The key to this is it takes one image, and that one image contains all that data. So
very cool.
So you can freeze frame an action shot with like 5 things flying past you at different depths or distances from the lens, and you'll get it all, and just like frozen in time there. And then there's a video. I'm not sure where the video is. I think Slashdot picked this up, and then it linked off to an article somewhere where there was a video, which was pretty cool too, where the guy was showing, I think it's their founder for the whole Litro thing, where you can actually shift like the perspective with your mouse. So even though you may not have a 3D monitor or the ability to show 3D, you could actually like shift perspective, since it knows which parts of the plane are in focus and which ones aren't. It can sort of like separate them out, and then you would drag the mouse around the scene, and it would change your point of view a little bit. So sort of like those cool effects in some of the commercials where you could tell it's just a freeze frame picture, but they sort of
yeah. I've always wanted to do that for our podcast.
So somebody painfully had to mask out like the person and the background and all this just to make the one move in front of the other. Well, this thing just does it. It's just right out of the camera.
Nice.
But there's some really cool stuff. Like there's actually one picture where you're in an airplane, and how many times has this happened on any kind of an autofocus camera? There's rain on the window of the airplane. You're trying to take a picture out the window. The camera keeps focusing. Well, there is no focus. So yes, you have the raindrops on the window in one part, but if you click on the right spot, which Burke is trying in a very bad way to click on.
You do it at the face where the wing
let me let you know something. It's called manual focus.
Oh, Jesus.
Ouch. Burn.
Yeah. But this
I'm
would
lazy.
get,
I'm too lazy for that.
This would get anything in the near field, far field. It just gets it all at the same time.
This is a good use of GPU, heterogeneous computing, right? This is getting as much information as you can out of a device at one time, and then letting the computer filter through things, figure out what exactly you want out of it at any given time, as opposed to having to use manual focus, and then you are limited to that focal point. And we don't want to be limited by focal points, Josh.
Yeah.
We don't want to be limited.
And if it's on an AMD processor, it won't be shaky either.
So basically what it is, and if any of you have a real keen eye and you're looking at some of those, look at some of the pictures on there where the image in the near field is has really sharp edges to it, and then if you shift it to something that's on the far, you can actually tell if you're focused on the far one. Far. If you're focused on the far one, but you're looking at the outer edge of the near one that's now blurry, you can actually tell that the image was going through those small spherical lenses, because you can see at the outer edge of the near image, it'll have this little sort of screen door looking distortion on it. So it's pretty cool. You can sort of tell how the technology works even. But what really excites me about this is that if this is how good these pictures are coming out of the camera, and this is the first generation, and then you take this and you combine it with higher megapixels and smaller spheres, then this can just get really, really cool. Like you could potentially end up with an actual video stream.
Yep.
That has the whole focal, that you can just shift. Imagine if you could shift focus in post on a video. You're like, I want to.
Showing it this. You should come to these really cool events that I go to. They were showing that kind of stuff. They were doing that in post and video. Yeah.
Take me with you.
Nah, I'm good. All right, so that's going to wrap up the show. PCPro.com/podcast is the URL you need to share with everybody, because they want to hear people ramble on about that kind of stuff too. Twitter.com/PCPer, or Twitter.com/Ryan Shrout, or Facebook.com/PCPer are obviously the places you can go to keep up to date with all of our news items and reviews as they come out. Or, even better, just PCPer.com as the homepage there. So if you have emails for us, and we didn't get to any more this week again because we had so much to talk about, podcast@PCPer.com is the email address for that. 1-888-38-PCPer, toll-free in the U.S. and Canada, except for Vancouver now, is the number you can call for leaving a voicemail, that kind of thing. So with that, we will finally close out the show. I'm Ryan Shrout.
I'm Jeremy Hellstrom.
I'm Josh Walrath.
And I'm Al Alventano.
Thanks for listening.